So about a month ago or two, probably two, Tom Bailey and I were talking about this weekend and this event in particular, and he had mentioned Andrew O'Shaughnessy to me, and I said, "Oh, I know him. Yeah, that would be a really great thing to do, to have him come down here." So it's been great to reconnect with Andrew. He came in late yesterday afternoon, and Min and I had a nice dinner and evening with him. And this idea really emanated from, I think, Jim Chandler and a couple of others suggesting that when we had a meeting like this, let's have some sort of education and programming. And so it's been nice to have a number of lectures. Andrew grew up in the middle of England, went to a public school, which is a private school in England, called Bedford. And he then matriculated at Oxford at Oriel College, where he did 3 degrees. He taught at a couple of prep schools, including Eton. And he was a colleague of a good friend of mine named Rafe Townsend. So that's one of the ways I know Andrew. Rafe was the head of Winchester College in England. And then he eventually came to the States. He taught at SMU for a year, and then he went up to Wisconsin. He was giving us a little overview of his life in Wisconsin. Never thought he'd be there that long, but it turned out to be a really good journey because he gained a lot of responsibility, became a chair of the department there, and was in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and enjoyed the small college world there and life in Wisconsin. And then went down to Charlottesville, to Monticello, and I think had a dual appointment with the university and with Monticello, where he was for 19 years. And now he works exclusively, I think, at Virginia in the history department, and he's considering, if things work out, perhaps going to Mount Vernon next. So you are invited to ask him some questions, and hope that you will enjoy getting to know him as much as I have. Please join me in welcoming Andrew O'Shaughnessy to MBA.
Well, I want to thank especially Thomas and Tom Bailey for this invitation. I sailed with him round the Aegean in September. The topic was the classical origins of the American democratic ideal. It was a marvelous trip and a great opportunity to know him. But what I really came to know was this academy, because he talked about it a lot. And earlier today, I got to sit in classes. I was horrified because they put me straight in front of the class, and that was marvelous because it was very nicely set up to have a conversation. They're really very impressive students. I'm a huge fan of Dead Poets Society. I think it's the best movie Robin Williams ever made, and so it's marvelous for me to be here. Headmaster Brad, it's very good to see you again and to be able to talk about our friendship with Rafe Townsend. Did I just lose that? Anyway, I'm going to be talking on the subject of a book I have just published called The Illimitable Freedom of the Human Mind, Thomas Jefferson's Idea of a University. I know that when I first suggested this to Tom, he was a bit worried. I mean, very probably enslaved people, but he had his own line. He was sticking it in the ground. He drew his own chart. He planned the library and wrote out more than 6,000 book titles for the library. That instantly made it the second largest library of any university in America. The largest was Harvard, which had been founded 200 years earlier, which tells you how remarkable it was. He invited every student to dinner at Monticello. Syllabus and reading list for Anglo-Saxon. And those people who think he was a STEM guy, he just thought that it was important to study practical subjects that would lead to a career, should think again that he thought Anglo-Saxon essential, because Anglo-Saxon, he argued, gave you a good sense of the English language. It was basic to the American legal system, and he regarded the Saxons as the first Democrats. I was mentioning that he invited the students up for dinner, and I always like to show his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, because when they came into the hall, he would show them the original Declaration of Independence, and he'd really impress them, and this was the last year of his life. He would really impress them by telling them stories of the original founders, and his favorite ones to talk about were Washington and Franklin. He hated the actual Declaration of Independence. He thought his earlier draft much superior and didn't like the changes made by Congress, and that's why he made a point always that people should see the original declaration. And I've met at least one historian who agrees with him, and I've yet really to ask her in detail why she thinks it's so much better. It's very difficult to read now because we're so used to the language and wording of the final version. On his tombstone, Jefferson wanted this listed as one of his 3 greatest achievements in life. First, he wanted father of the University of, firstly, he wanted, here lies Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. That has been the most important statute in terms of our interpreting the First Amendment rights on religion. And finally, father of the University of Virginia. And part of my book is arguing that his ideas about education should rank with these other great achievements, because although the university was the only product that really emerged from his ideas, he actually had a much bigger vision for education, that it also included the primary level and what today would be juniors and seniors. He wanted to create what would have been the first public school system anywhere in the world, in Virginia. He insisted to an abolitionist who wanted to create African American schools that his school would have allowed for free, and there were now quite a few after the American Revolution, free African Americans, manumitted African Americans in Virginia to attend, and he argued it's better to have a mixed race school than to create separate schools, which is very interesting. Although he did acknowledge, he said the Virginia people would probably not do it, even though it would be a good idea. And he was going to give any free person, including women, 3 years of free education. And then the brightest of the boys would get scholarships to go on, and finally they would get a scholarship to William and Mary, which at the time was the main college and the oldest college in the state. And he put these ideas forward in 1779. The only other place in the world they were really thinking about public education was Prussia. And the great difference is Frederick the Great wanted the education system to strengthen the power of the state and his autocracy. So he had smart people running the bureaucracy. Jefferson wanted an education system to hold the elected officials responsible, to make them accountable. And of those who went on to the university, he wanted them to be educated and to think in terms of what they called virtue, which means what virtue does now, but it also meant the idea of putting aside your self-interest and acting for the public good. Of course, his ideas never fully matched the rhetoric. Like the Declaration of Independence, it was flawed. We've already mentioned the presence of slavery. It was meant to be a cheap university. It was meant to have scholarships. It became the most expensive university after Harvard right up until the Civil War. And that is in spite of the fact that a third of the revenue came from the state, which would be true of no state university today. I mean, in Virginia, it's now below 5%, but it was still the most expensive, and it had no scholarships. Jefferson is sometimes accused of not having believed in true freedom of ideas because he wanted it to be a Republican university, because he saw the Republican creed as the true creed of the American Revolution. I've always thought criticisms on that front really not fair. It seems to me that even the books he hated were taught. My favorite story of students going to dine at Jefferson's was told by a guy called Henry Tirrett, who later founded a university of his own, or was part of founding the University of Alabama. And Tirrett came back to the 50th reunion, and he described what one of these dinners was like. And he said that Jefferson would push his chair away from the table because he couldn't hear very well. And then he would want to just watch the students talking with each other, because to him, this was what the college education was all about. Conversation, sharing passions and interests. And he said that Jefferson's daughter was the one who held forth and basically acted as the hostess. And he said she teased Jefferson throughout the evening and talked about books she knew Jefferson disapproved of and said how much she liked them. Jefferson modeled his ideas for the university on his own training at William and Mary. And for him, personal contact was so essential, something we should have realized when people started to talk about virtual education and MOOCs, massive online education. One of the great things I observed today at the school was the sheer small size of the class. I can't see anyone who would not benefit from having groups that small and being able to, not to be able to hide at the back of a class, but to be very much part of the conversation. And one of the things we learned during the pandemic is that most individuals simply don't have the self-discipline to conduct their own education. And to be able to do this online, your peers are all important, in some ways as important as the teachers. These are the people who help set the benchmark, to whom you can turn with questions if you don't want to ask the teacher. The three great figures in his life at college, one was the governor of the state, Governor Fakir. Another was William Small, his Scottish tutor, the only layman teaching of William and Mary, and another was his law tutor, George Wiv. It's a marvelous story in a way because he was so influenced by his teachers, and he said, whenever I have to think of what is the right thing to do, he said, I ask myself, what would a Wiv or a Small or a Fakir, what would he have done in the same situation? And so I'm just going to briefly, because I'm worried you're going to miss these cocktails, and I know you'd like some questions, I'm just going to give you the postage stamp version of what was unique about this. What did he bring? And one of the key concepts was the academical village. And what he meant by that was an institution of learning should be a community. And he wanted the professors to live among the students, which was a mixed blessing for the professors. But these very large buildings here, those were the houses for the professors. They do look particularly impressive. However, the lecture room was part of it. And one of the first wives at the university objected to the smells coming from the laboratory. And the first and only building that Jefferson added to his original design was a laboratory because she won. Another unique feature was the place of religion. This was the first secular university. And this, it seems to me, was terribly important. A lot of people have questioned, why did he have a university in the South? Why was that so important? It must have been to protect slavery. On the contrary, the South was much more flexible than the North. And this may seem odd as we think of the South now as they call it the buckle on the Bible Belt. But there was much more free thinking in the South. The South would become much more evangelical during and after Jefferson's lifetime. But what he did at the University of Virginia could not have been done in New England, where they still had state religion in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And he was very much influenced by this man, Joseph Priestley. While he was designing the university, he did his famous edition of what's known as the Jefferson Bible, the Gospels, where he cut out passages that he thought were added by subsequent ages. Any kind of miracle story, he reduced it essentially to a set of social mores. It was unusual in that he wanted student governance, which was later embodied in the honor system. He wanted students to live in groups of one or two. Interestingly, that was largely for health reasons. He wanted faculty excellence. This guy, Robert Lee Dunglinson, is known as the father of American physiology. He had this idea of getting the best and the brightest. He was criticized because he brought so many of them from England. And he said, I don't want Harvard's hand-me-downs or anyone that is, I want to get the very best. But even John Adams thought that extreme. He wanted the faculty to have a large degree of self-governance themselves. There was to be no dean. He didn't want a hierarchical structure. That disappeared in 1900, but it lasted for a while. This man was one of the famous chairs of the university. This is one of my favorite ideas of his. He wanted to turn the dome of the rotunda of the university, which housed the library, he wanted to turn it into a planetarium and have a student move a boomstick with a professor sitting on a saddle, pointing to the different planets. And we really have run out of time, so I'm going to just end with two points. One is it had a huge impact on higher education in America, especially in the South. And the most important impact that in many ways is still one of the defining features of American universities is the idea of the elective system, that the students choose their own courses. In many ways, he made them freer than they are today. They could do it in any order. They were not in a class and going through in an age group. He basically wanted them to choose between three subjects. It was almost like having three majors. But they could plan their process of study. And places that were much influenced by him, University of MIT, William Barton Rogers, the founder there, was a former professor at the University of Virginia. The University of Texas, University of Florida were hugely influenced by Jefferson's plans. Harvard, bizarrely, was especially interested in his idea of an elective curriculum. And several of Harvard's most famous professors and their presidents took a particular interest in Jefferson. I think the last example was in the 1960s of a Harvard president who wrote specifically on Jefferson's ideas on education. I think, though, what I especially, and that actually was London University, University College London, which I was showing, which was the first college outside of Oxford and Cambridge in England, and that was set up as a secular university, very much like the University of Virginia. I want to end with this, because I think it's very important in terms of when we're talking about Jefferson and trying to find this right balance in discussing him. He would not be the least surprised by modern-day criticisms. Indeed, he predicted them. He said to his colleagues, "We will be regarded like our witch-burning grandparents." He understood that over time, people look old-fashioned, and values can change, priorities change, and the discovery of new knowledge leads to a lot of change. And what he argued was that that was a good thing. He said that the living generation should not be held back by what he called the dead hand of the past. They should be willing to rethink everything from anew. Even the founders, he said, they shouldn't see these people as greater people than themselves. They should realize that they were humans, that they were frail, although he did know that they would have this legendary influence on America. But he said, really, the purpose of the university, and indeed in life generally, was that people should use evidence and their reason to improve their society. And while it's now common, and if you go on and look at memes of people of the age group you're teaching, the word hypocrisy in Jefferson are favorably juxtaposed, it's worth remembering he was an idealist who wanted to improve his society. And I've no objection to people judging the past, but we should also judge ourselves by the past. And remember, this was someone who wanted to improve their society, who devoted his life to doing so, and ask ourselves what we're doing of a similar kind. Thank you very much indeed. And I know we're pretty well into cocktails. I suggest one major change, though. You have cocktails before lectures. Yeah. Well, and he's that Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. A friend of mine and colleague is a lawyer and did an excellent book showing how the Supreme Court had used that for most of the 19th and early 20th century as the main source of interpreting what did separation mean. He never actually used that expression precisely, but when the Danville Baptists wrote to him as president, wanting to have a day of fasting and thanksgiving, he wrote back and said that there should be a wall of separation. And I think when you look at his plans for the university, you can see how serious he was about that. I mean, you could argue that that was, I mean, if I was to say he didn't entirely abide by the idea of freedom of speech, I would use the example of religion, because he wouldn't have a department of theology, and he would only teach religion as history or as literature, but he wouldn't teach any theology, and of course there was no chapel. On the other hand, he argued there were lots of churches in Charlottesville, and that actually would lead to a more dynamic religious life. And I was talking to one of the teachers earlier today who was in Charlottesville for several years, and in fact part of my own congregation at what was Jefferson's Episcopalian church, since there was no Unitarian church for him to go to. And we agreed that, in actual fact, has made American religious life much more dynamic. The irony is that England has an official religion, and it's dead. And church attendance is much lower. In fact, Adam Smith used it, and this individual teaches economics, as an example of what happens when you have a monopoly. He said, because the Church of England's the official church and it's a monopoly, it's absolutely dead because it's not competitive. Yes?
So Thomas Jefferson being a lifelong learner and believing strongly in that, do you feel that he changed his values as he reached his final years? And if so, in what areas do you think that he
That's very interesting, whether he was consistent throughout his life. And I think a lot of his ideas were modified. One of his views on the economy and Alexander Hamilton's reforms. And he was against having a national bank, he was against having a currency system and running a national debt. And he was somewhat hostile to the idea of industrialization because he felt that it would encourage urbanization and lead to a class system and concentration of people in towns, which he didn't like because he'd seen it in Europe. He really wanted an America of yeoman farmers. But in a way, although that remained his ideal, he accepted a lot of the changes, and there are certainly plenty of other examples where he moderated his views, especially when he didn't feel that there was such a threat from people that he thought were trying to replicate the British system and make America a colony of Britain. When I talk about slavery, I say we have to remember Jefferson, like all of us, had conflicting objectives. There are things you want to do that are not entirely compatible, and you have to prioritize. And for him and for Washington, for that matter, although both would have loved to have seen the end of slavery in America, the most important thing was the survival of the Union and the Republican system, because nothing could be achieved without it. All the best ideas and the best will in the world couldn't be achieved without the survival of that system. And they realized it would come apart if they brought the issue of slavery to the forefront. Unfortunately, slavery became more important because of the cotton gin and the Cotton Revolution. There was a period just after the American Revolution where it really looked possible it might just disappear. It was one of the few issues that had the potential to bring apart the whole system. And of course, it very nearly did. Yes?
You mentioned there were some changes to the Declaration of Independence from his first draft.
Yes.
I think you said Congress made those changes. What were a few of them that were made?
Well, one of the most famous was his denunciation of the slave trade, in which he said that he accused George III of being responsible for essentially, and he was really using George III figuratively, but being responsible for hooking Americans onto this method of labor that he saw as corrosive to the society. And the members from South Carolina wanted that removed. It came too close for them, even though they were quite willing. And this is something we forget. A lot of slave states were willing to abolish the slave trade. And Jamaica was petitioning for it all the time, had many more slaves than any of the states here. Although they were willing to do that, anything that looked like a condemnation of slavery more generally, they're uncomfortable with. And it's interesting, though, that Jefferson was willing to go that far. Yes?
I thought it was interesting on his gravestone when he chose to put as his accomplishments, because there are so many, not even President of the United States or Louisiana Purchase or the Louisiana Department, any of those things that were also so phenomenal.
So I once took a British advertising executive who oversaw the world's largest advertising company and showed him the grave. He knew very little American history. So he looked at it purely through the eyes of an advertising person and said, that is very smart, because this is about freedom of ideas, education. You can't quarrel with any of those ideas. If he'd started mentioning that he'd been president, it would have reminded people of the opposition and what they didn't like about him. This is all about inspiring ideas. But it is true, he didn't mention President of the United States or Vice President or Governor of Virginia. And I always think it's fun to compare it with William Byrd II's gravestone at Westover, which is much bigger, and you have to wrap round to read it all. And he lists all the important people he's met in his life. And the fact that he went to Oxford and spent time in England. And it's very interesting because it really, that would have been in the kind of 1730s. It was a much more insecure generation than Jefferson's. At the same time, Jefferson didn't have this need to have all of this, but he did write his own epitaph.
So my tombstone is going to say that this headmaster had more football wins than any other. Guy that changed the spaghetti supper. I wonder what Jefferson would have thought about Kennedy's wonderful line about Jefferson when he had all the Nobel Prize writers at the White House.
Yeah.
You know that line.
He said, this is the greatest collection of mine since Thomas Jefferson dined alone. Going back to that opening statement, no world leader has spent so much time thinking of university. For these kinds of reasons, we can't just dispense with Jefferson, and especially at this moment where, whichever side of the aisle you're on, you feel that democracy may be in jeopardy, if not here, abroad. Jefferson had some of the most inspiring words about the dangers of tyranny, and you could say it was precisely because he was a slave punter that he understood tyranny on a very personal level and saw how corrosive and corrupting it could be. Thank you.